Okay, so kind of an offshoot of the whole Generations film series is I thought I would compare the 35 watt G2 to the 65 watt G2. Just to look at some differences. We'll talk a little bit later about specifically the CPUs and why you would want to go one or the other. But I thought I'd first start with just the physical. So you'll notice right away, and I didn't notice until I started doing this video, is the fact that the G2 35 watt has no vents, where the whole thing is ventilated, which is very interesting. I don't know if they continued that with later models. And what intrigues me is that I thought that you could take a 35 watt unit and sort of turn it into 65 watt just by a couple things with the fans and with the power supply and so forth. But you would also conceivably want to get the better ventilation. So, you're maybe better off just getting a 65 watt unit to begin with. Okay, so there we have some differences there. And if we look at the front, identical, no real surprise there. Turn it around. Backs, identical too. These just happen to be two different units. This top one has the HDMI option, and this is still using the display port. And of course the extra one here, both have VGA. If I look on the bottom of the 65 watt, it actually specifies the fact that it's 65 watt. It's 19.5 volts, but what is that? 4.62 amps, where the back of this one also says, spells out the fact that it's 35 watt, but it's the normal 3.33, where of course the other one was 4.62, quite a difference. And we just want to make sure that our power supplies match this. This is going to need a 65 watt power supply. This is going to be a 90 watt. If you don't use a 90 watt, you're going to get beeps when you try to bring it up. Although I have used the European 85 watt, and it's still, this one came up without a problem. One thing I forgot to record is the sound when you plug in a 65 watt power supply to the 65 watt G2 as opposed to putting in the 90 watt. One, two, three. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I always like to show everything, so here's the inside, and it's showing the 35 watt for this guy, and of course the 65 for this one. And you can clearly see quite a difference between the two. I actually have this grill, or used to have this grill on the first G2 I ever got, but then, which was strange because it was a 35 watt, so there was a little mix-up. But then when I got that ill-fated parts computer, it had this cover. So now my G2 35 watt has all the correct equipment. Okay, so here we're looking on the innards, and first glance, everything looks, they're twins in terms of the layout. Everything. Which pretty much, as far as I know, and please leave comments if you know different, that the stuff is identical except for one thing that I'm going to show you in a second here. The 65 watt has this extra fan for the SATA, and as you notice, plugs into down here. And I've heard that if you don't have this fan, or it doesn't detect it, you'll get an error when it's trying to start up, saying that, hey, I really need that extra cooling in my system. So I did confirm. This is what you'll get if you disconnect the fan or don't have the fan when you try to boot. But beyond that, because it's pretty much, they just took this same caddy and see the screws, you take those out, then you can buy this fan and stick it in there. So conceivably you could turn a 35 into a 65. If you're also willing, of course, you're going to need a different processor. These are the T processors, where these are just the plain. So this right now has a i5-6500T. This is i5-6500 plain. And I'm going to, after this, show some specs and differences between the two processors and why someone might want to go with the 65 watt. And as I mentioned before, if you're going to need to make sure that you've got the 90 watt power supply. I would also make sure that it has the right voltage and also amperage. Okay, people are probably going to ask, well, what should I buy, 35 or 65? Interesting question. In my case, I thought I was getting a 35 and they sent me a 65. But I use this as my normal day-to-day machine. And this is the one that I do all of my editing on. And it's served me well. This 35 watt, of course, just like my others I've used, I think it comes down to things such as you're going to have obviously a little more noise because you got two fans with the 65 watt. You're going to be drawing more juice because you have a processor that needs that additional wattage. So it kind of comes down to what you really are using it for. I would think, especially if you're going to have something running 24/7 like a Proxmox, maybe trying to get something that has a lower draw might be a better idea. You're probably going to be able to find your power supplies easier. I didn't have much problem with this, although you do have to make sure, because there are a lot of 90 watts out there that don't have the correct specs. So I think it just comes down to what you're using it for and why you would want to go one way or the other. Interesting. I don't know if that's just coloring, but this is a little more gold and this is a little more silver. But maybe this is just, I don't know, wear and tear. Little things that you notice as you're playing around. They both, use the same kind of memory, et cetera, et cetera. Again, though, you would need the cage. Make sure that when you are getting a 65 watt, that you are getting the chassis that has the extra ventilation, that you are getting this fan, that this fan is working. So we're going to, after this, I'll show some of the other specs. Okay, so the whole reason that someone would want to get a 65 watt G2 or G3 for whichever is for the faster CPU. And so if we look at this on Intel's site, if we compare the two processors, 6500T, of course, is for the 35 watt. Very similar as far as cores, threads, everything else. This is where you see the difference. The turbo frequency, what is that, 0.5 higher. You've got the boost, also 0.5. Big jump in the base frequency. But that also comes at a price because, of course, you are using more juice. You've got your 35 versus 65. If you scroll down, a lot of the stuff is very similar. One interesting thing, where is it? I believe it has to do with the T case. So it will handle the 6500 a little higher temperature than the other. But that also makes sense because you're running at a higher frequency. You're just doing more stuff. And so consequently, you need the extra fan, you need the extra ventilation. So that's something to take into account. Now, as we were talking before, well, which one would I go with? It'd be hard for me to make a real guess without, again, it depends on what you're doing with it. In my case, I just sort of started using the 6500, the 6500 straight, the 65 watt for all my day-to-day stuff, mainly because I thought, well, I'm not going to be having my PC on all the time. Let's go with something that even if it's using more juice, I'm not doing it 24/7, and maybe I could use my G2 35 watt if I was going to set up some sort of Proxmox or NAS or something that's 24/7, where I don't need maybe processing power, but I want to keep it quiet, cool, and lower power consumption. So it kind of again depends on what you're doing. If you're going to race the Le Mans, you're going to need a Formula One. But if you're going to the store, that's a little overkill, and you're going to use a lot of gas to get there, and you may have trouble parking. So it really comes down to what you need. Sometimes it's a little easier to find the 35 watt. That's kind of the standard one out there. And I kind of wonder when they were selling these to businesses, especially in bulk, maybe the 65 watt were used for more intensive operations. And so maybe not as many of those are out there. So keep your eye open. A lot of times they won't even call it out. Sometimes they'll mismark them. So you do need to look on the pictures on the bottom, and do remember that you are going to need that 90 watt power supply.